The truth about male suicide. Men commit suicide 4 times as often as women in the United States, and no one really knows why. This has been going on for many years. This chart shows this ratio as being stable from 1950 to 2014, so that tells us that the ratio is not due to some recent shift in our cultural values or due to the economy or some other external source. The blue line is the males, the black line is the females, and both show U.S. suicides per 100,000. There are other stats that show that even in the 19th century, this ratio seems to hold up. But why? First, we need to look at the standard manner of dismissing such a huge difference. So many people, including people in our educational systems, suicide prevention organizations, and even researchers, make the claim that men commit suicide more often due to their choice of lethal means to kill themselves. You can see this claim in this blurb from Wikipedia. The standard argument goes like this. They point out that 25,926 males used lethal means to kill themselves in the United States in 2012, and only 2,818 females used the same lethal means. Most listen and then nod in agreement at how many men use lethal means and how few women, assuming this must be why men suicide more often than women. Oh boy. But wait. Many more males than females commit suicide, so it's more accurate to compare the percentage of male and female suicides that use lethal means. Have a look at this chart and notice that the men choose the lethal means of hanging or firearms in about 81.6% of their completed suicides. But also notice that women choose the same lethal means in 54.7% of their completed suicides. Those two numbers are not that far apart. Yes, this is probably a part of the reason for men to complete suicide more often than women, but it in no way explains the mammoth 4-to-1 ratio that's been held up for years. Something else is obviously happening. Of course, there are other myth makers, including the CBC, who recently blamed toxic masculinity for men's suicidal quadrupling. This is, of course, totally blaming the victim, but in a gynocentric world, it flies just fine. Go figure. There's a massive amount of misandrist ideas about why men suicide more often. They run the gamut from men are cold, to men's egos are being too large, to men are just holding back their emotions to hurt women, and on and on and on. Beyond these crazy myths, the bottom line is that most people are not even concerned about this difference. They're happy just to ignore it and write it off. This is not just the general population. This includes professionals. If you look at the suicide prevention websites, you'll notice that this problem is rarely discussed on the first page, and all too often not even on later pages. They usually fail to tell their readers that the largest risk factor for suicide is being male. This is such an important piece of data, it's hard to believe that they routinely omit it, but they do. Even government reports on suicide. Yes, a 200-page government report on suicide prevention only mentioned men once in passing. College classes, media stories, suicide conferences, and many others tend to do the same thing and ignore males. They fail miserably in alerting people to this massive and important difference. People are simply not interested. Even researchers lack interest. Just try and find research studies that look into the reasons for this difference. You probably won't find much. Researchers seem to prefer to study females and suicide. Just ask Lanny Berman, the past president of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, about this, and he'll let you know it's not easy to get funding to study boys and men. Here's a quote from Berman on this topic in the San Francisco Chronicle in 2006. As much as I would love to lead the charge in finding out why boys kill themselves, try and go out and get funding for it. Berman voices the truth that funders all too often earmark their money to study girls and women, not boys and men. I once noticed that the National Association of Social Workers did a study on girls and suicide. I was shocked, so I wrote a letter of complaint to the director, who got back to me saying that the funder had specified the money could only be spent on research on females. We're left in an uncaring, gynocentric swamp that just doesn't care about men. Now, there is one man, a psychologist named Thomas Joyner, who's theorized about this difference, and Joyner points out a possible contributing factor to the 4-to-1 ratio is that men are more fearless, and this fearlessness allows them the courage to end their own lives. A very interesting and likely, at least partially true idea, but again, it'd be difficult to explain such a huge difference by one psychological trait. I think Joyner is onto something, but I think it's just a part of the puzzle. Let's turn to some other male-friendly ideas that might bring us a better understanding of why boys and men are so much more likely to complete suicide. Let's first look at the cultural messages. It starts early. Little boys are told that big boys don't cry. Most of us shudder at the thought that this clearly tells boys they need to stuff their feelings, but there's an even more pernicious aspect to this. When an adult tells a little boy that big boys don't cry, they're indeed telling him to stuff his feelings, but they're also telling him something else. They're telling him that when he does feel hurt and in need of support, that they, the adult offering this idea, will not be there to help and offer him compassion. So the message is twofold. First, it tells the boy to stuff it, and second, it alerts him that when he is feeling hurt, he should not expect support or compassion. He watches as his sisters get what he lacks. With this default, it's simple to see that he'll be unlikely to seek help when he's been taught for years that no support will be there when he's in need. Much has been said about men being reluctant to express emotions, but what has not been pointed out is that no one really wants to hear men's emotions. How about you? When was the last time you offered to listen to a man who was emoting? Most of us have to answer that we haven't done that for a very long time, or possibly ever. A man's emotional pain is generally seen as taboo, something people want to avoid. You can contrast this with the way people see women's emotional pain, and you see that women's pain is seen as a call to action. When women have tears, people scurry to help. When men have tears, people simply scurry away. But that's far from all our culture does to boys and men. As boys get older, the culture works to discourage any signs of their dependency. Men and sometimes older boys must appear to have things covered by themselves to appear independent, and when they don't, guess what happens? They're shamed as not being real men. A man named Peter Marin wrote an excellent article on homelessness and explained this very dynamic. Here's what he said. To put it simply, men are neither supposed nor allowed to be dependent. They are expected to take care of others and themselves, and when they cannot or will not do it, then the assumption at the heart of the culture is that they are somehow less than men and therefore unworthy of help. An irony asserts itself. By being in need of help, men forfeit the right to it. Exactly. A man's choice is to appear independent or face being judged as not being a real man. The hallmark of a suicidal person is to feel hopeless and helpless. So the man who feels hopeless and helpless also knows that if he exposes this, he'll be judged as not being a real man. This is a very tough double bind that men face. If I do open up about my helplessness and hopelessness, I'll be judged harshly. If I don't open up, I'm totally on my own. Most men choose to be on their own. Can you blame them? This is just one facet of what scientists have called precarious manhood. They've shown that around the world, men and young men are expected to prove their manhood repeatedly in order to be considered men. Men are under constant surveillance to appear independent, and if they fail to appear independent, they pay a severe price in being devalued and judged as not being real men. Women face nothing similar. When girls reach physical maturity, they're considered women. Not so for the boys. Men intuitively understand this. They live it on a daily basis. However, women are not under similar pressures and don't realize the hardships that men face. Too many times, women simply expect men to be more like them. I often see it in the couples therapy I do. The women expect their men to talk openly about their vulnerabilities, their feelings, and their need for help. This, of course, flies in the face of his certainty that his neediness and his feelings will do nothing but harm to him and expose his dependence. He has a natural and learned tendency to do his best to appear independent, and he comes by it honestly. For us to suddenly expect him to do a complete 180-degree change and appear needy is a bizarre and unreasonable expectation. Guys, here's a tip. Buy a copy of my inexpensive and short book, The Way Men Heal, and give it to your girlfriend or wife. If she will read it, your relationship will improve. She may get some understanding of the way you are. End advertisement. At any rate, these two elements, not expecting any help to be available and routinely being shamed for any sign of dependence, have a cumulative impact on men. When men do feel hopeless and helpless, it's easy to see now why he would be less likely to open up about this to anybody. This leaves others not knowing about the man's pain and decreases the chances that they'll push him towards help. And that takes us to the next section on research. Let's turn to the research and see if there are studies that help us understand why men would be so much more likely to complete suicide. The work of Shelley Taylor is a good example of research that helps us in understanding this problem. Taylor realized in the early 2000s that nearly all of the research on stress had been done only on male subjects. Women had been left out. What we know about fight and flight surely applies to men. Taylor proceeded to only study women under stress. She wondered if women might have different strategies. She found that women, unlike men, would be much more likely to tend and befriend. That is, women were more likely to move towards interaction when stressed, to move towards other people. A sharp contrast to the male tendency of fight and flight that moves men either into action or inaction. So think about it. Can you see how the female nature of moving towards others when stressed will make it much more likely that she will interact with a person who will realize her distress and then push her to seek services? Notice also that the male tendency to move to action or inaction under stress takes him away from concern to others. Indeed, action and inaction are very powerful forms of healing, but they do leave men more on their own to heal, and a very powerful depression is a very difficult thing to heal by ourselves. The more feminine interactive modes are more likely to open avenues of loving others, challenging our shame, guilt, and self-deprecation. Healing with action and inaction will often lack this outer challenge from someone we love, and this leaves men more at risk to persistent negative thoughts, shame, and guilt. His pain is less visible to others, and this is dangerous in a powerful depression. Let's summarize what's been said so far. 1. There's an indifference to men's suicide in the general public, among psychological professionals, and among researchers. People don't care. This is likely a function of men's disposability. 2. Boys are shamed for emoting and experience a simultaneous withdrawal of support and care. This continues and worsens as they grow older. 3. A man's emotional pain is taboo. No one wants to touch it. He's alone with his pain. 4. Men are disallowed dependency, and a public expression of tender emotions exposes his lack of independence. 5. Boys and men face the gauntlet of precarious manhood, which demands they prove their manhood repeatedly. 6. Men are naturally drawn to active or inactive modes of healing, which makes his healing quiet and much less visible. 7. These active modes are powerful, but limit the life-giving connections that women are more likely to receive in their tend and befriend modes of healing. I hope it's starting to become more clear why men are more likely to commit suicide. This is the end of Part 1, and in Part 2, we're going to focus on 3 additional elements: his biology, the male hierarchy, and the cultural devaluation of men, and how these impact his healing and his vulnerability to suicide. Until then, please keep in mind that men are good, as are you, sir. If you find this video helpful, please do come and see me on Patreon, and don't forget to like, share, comment, and all that stuff.